It was the 26th of December, 1900, when the first shockwave of mystery struck the small coastal town of Leverbers on the Isle of Harris. The relief vessel, Hesperus, approached the Flannan Isles Lighthouse to deliver supplies and rotate the crew. But what they encountered was nothing short of chilling, an eerie, suffocating silence. The lighthouse stood dark and unmanned. All three men had disappeared without a trace. No letter, no signs of struggle, no explanation, just gone, never to be seen again. The crew of the Hesperus had expected a routine visit. These supply runs had happened many times before, predictable, uneventful. This time, everything was wrong. There was no sign of life, no welcoming signal, no smoke rising from the chimney. The lighthouse, a critical beacon for passing ships, was deathly silent. Inside, the scene was even more disturbing. Meals sat half-eaten on the kitchen table. Two of the keepers' heavy weatherproof coats were missing. One coat remained abandoned, suggesting that someone had left the lighthouse without even dressing for the brutal Atlantic winds. Most ominously, all the clocks had stopped. In that stillness, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, the men charged with guarding the light, had vanished. The grim calm inside the lighthouse hinted at something far more terrifying than a simple accident. No struggle, no panic, no clues. Only questions. Questions that have haunted investigators for more than a century. Did a sudden rogue wave strike the island, sweeping all three men into the sea before they could react? Did Donald MacArthur's known violent temper lead to a fatal confrontation inside the lighthouse? Were the men terrified by something they believed they saw? A storm? An apparition? Or something else? To this day, the answers to these questions remain buried beneath the mystery of the Flannan Isles. So, let's find out what really happened. This is Nocturnal Cases, Mysteries Unfiltered. The first clue came in the form of a small logbook, the personal record of the men. The log entries, specifically the ones made by Thomas Marshall, the second assistant keeper, were the first to provide any insight into their final days. His entries began innocuously enough, describing the weather and the mundane activities typical of lighthouse life. But things took a turn on December 12th, just a few days before the men vanished. Marshall's first signs of distress appeared in the log entry that day, when he described a terrible storm that had struck the island. The problem was that no storm had been reported on that day by mainland weather stations. It would have been impossible to ignore such an event had it truly occurred. But Marshall's description of the storm was vivid. High winds, crashing waves, and an overwhelming sense of fear that seemed to infect the men. Was it just their loneliness playing tricks on them? Or had something far more ominous been at play? Marshall continued with a description of Ducat, the principal keeper, a man who was typically steadfast, becoming unusually quiet. Later entries noted the growing unease among the keepers. Donald MacArthur, the third man, was described as crying, something completely out of character for a man known for his hard demeanor. This raised further questions. What had happened during that storm that led to such fear? Was it something the men had witnessed, or had they finally succumbed to the pressure of isolation? The final entry, written on December 15th, read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." That was the last entry in the logbook. After that, the men simply vanished. The question remains, was the storm a real event, or had the men imagined it? Did they sense something beyond nature, something that terrified them into abandoning their post? If you've got theories, drop them below. But before that, like and subscribe, because trust me, the deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. In the immediate aftermath of the lighthouse being found abandoned, the Northern Lighthouse Board, NLB, launched an official inquiry, led by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, a man who had personally selected Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur for the assignment. The investigation was meticulous but frustratingly inconclusive. Muirhead's report detailed the scene in precise terms. Upon arrival, he found that the entrance gate and main door were closed and locked. Inside, the lighthouse was tidy and clean, suggesting no sign of a hurried departure. The kitchen utensils were washed, the beds made, and nothing inside the lighthouse showed evidence of violence or struggle. One of the oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats worn to protect against the Atlantic storms, was left behind, while the others were missing, reinforcing the idea that two men had gone outside prepared, and one had rushed out in haste, likely reacting to an emergency. At the western landing, the damage was more severe. Iron railings were twisted and bent, A massive box, once secured to the ground, had been shattered and its contents strewn about. Ropes usually stored safely were found scattered across the rocks. A lifebuoy had been torn from its mounting and lay halfway up a cliff face, suggesting a tremendous force at play. Yet, despite the clear signs of violent natural forces outside, the lighthouse itself remained strangely intact inside. There were no footprints, bloodstains, notes, or any physical clues to indicate what the men had faced. No personal effects were missing, apart from the 2 coats, and there was no suggestion of a long-prepared abandonment. The inquiry ultimately concluded that the most probable cause was that the men had been caught off guard by a sudden disaster while attempting to secure equipment during heavy weather. The likely scenario, according to Muirhead, was that Marshall and Ducat had gone out to secure the western landing equipment, fearing another storm. MacArthur, perhaps seeing them in trouble, rushed after them without stopping for his coat. A sudden wave, significantly larger than usual, could have engulfed all 3 men, sweeping them into the Atlantic. However, Muirhead himself admitted that this conclusion, though plausible, was based largely on circumstantial evidence. No bodies were ever recovered despite extensive searches. No wreckage or floating debris matching the missing equipment was found. The men had disappeared completely. There was no criminal evidence, no signs of internal conflict, and no suggestion of mental breakdowns severe enough to explain mass desertion of post. The investigation, for all its rigor, failed to provide a definitive answer. In the final NLB report, Superintendent Muirhead wrote, "I am of the opinion that the most probable explanation of the disappearance of the men is that they had all gone down to the landing to secure equipment, and that an unexpected and overwhelming sea had come upon them, sweeping them away." But even he acknowledged the lack of final proof. The public, dissatisfied with the mundane explanation of a freak wave, fueled alternative theories, conspiracies, murders, and supernatural interventions that persist to this day. Thus, even the official investigation only deepened the aura of mystery surrounding the Flannan Isles. The disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers led to numerous theories over the years, some plausible and others far more speculative. With no bodies found, no clues to follow, and no official records supporting the men's accounts of a storm, investigators have been forced to piece together the events using the evidence available. Theory 1, Rogue Wave Theory. The most widely accepted theory is the rogue wave, which also makes sense. Rogue waves are large, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous waves that appear without warning, sometimes reaching over 100 feet in height. A rogue wave could have struck the island, sweeping the men off the landing area while they were securing the lighthouse. There are several evidence supporting this theory: the damage to the western landing, the area where boats arrived. The damaged railings, bent metal, and massive stones moved out of place suggest that something extraordinary had occurred. Additionally, the missing coats could indicate that the men had rushed out of the lighthouse to confront the elements. If a rogue wave hit at that moment, the men might not have had time to react. However, there are problems with this theory. For one, there were no recorded storms in the area, and weather stations indicated calm seas. If a rogue wave had indeed struck, it would have been unusual not to find any physical trace of the men in the area. It's also worth noting that the men's final log entry, written just hours before their disappearance, mentions the sea being calm, a direct contradiction to the idea of a rogue wave. Theory 2, Murder-Suicide Theory. Another possible theory is a murder or suicide scenario. Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, was known for his volatile temperament and violent tendencies. Some speculate that he could have attacked the other 2 men, possibly due to tensions building up from months of isolation, loneliness, conflicts, and stress. In this scenario, MacArthur might have killed Ducat and Marshall before taking his own life, driven by guilt or the weight of his actions. However, this theory raises several issues. The authorities found no signs of blood or struggle in the lighthouse. Moreover, the logbook entries describe MacArthur as being fearful and upset, not aggressive. The men would have been well trained in handling conflict, and it seems unlikely that they would have succumbed to violence under such extreme circumstances. The idea that all 3 men would have been involved in such a violent act, particularly when no physical evidence supports it, is less plausible. Theory 3, Paranormal or Supernatural Explanations. The paranormal theories are among the most tantalizing and persistent. Some suggest that the 3 men were victims of supernatural forces, possibly drawn by the folklore surrounding the Flannan Isles. Local tales spoke of sea spirits, creatures of the deep, and strange happenings on the island long before the lighthouse was built. Was there something about the lighthouse that triggered the men's fear and ultimately led to their disappearance? Some even speculate that the storm described by Marshall wasn't a natural weather event at all, but a manifestation of some supernatural force. The men, trapped in isolation for weeks, might have started to hallucinate, leading them to believe they were under attack by unseen forces. The cryptic final log entry, "God is over all," could be seen as an indication of the men's submission to something beyond their understanding, perhaps even a divine or otherworldly intervention. Yet, despite the eerie nature of the story, no physical evidence has ever been found to support the idea of paranormal activity. The lighthouse itself remains untouched, and the records of the men's behavior prior to their disappearance are more likely to reflect the psychological strain of isolation, rather than a true encounter with the supernatural. The mystery of the Eilean Mor Lighthouse keepers remains unsolved to this day. Despite multiple investigations, no new evidence has emerged, and the theories continue to abound. The absence of the men's bodies and the strange final entries in the logbook ensures that the case remains a topic of fascination and speculation. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the story is the unanswered question: why did the men leave the lighthouse? They had a duty to maintain the light. They had experienced the island's harsh conditions before. They had no reason to abandon their post, and yet they did. As we look back at the events of December 1900, we are left with a chilling reality. Sometimes mysteries remain unsolved, not because we don't try to understand them, but because some truths are too elusive to be uncovered. No one can say for certain what happened to James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Was it nature's fury, a violent conflict between the men, or something far darker? What we do know is that over a century later, the lighthouse remains a symbol of their disappearance, a place where the boundaries of the known and unknown continue to blur. Their story, lost in time, is a reminder that no matter how much we search for answers, some questions will never be answered. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the most haunting part of all.